For this lecture is Postcolonial Nature Writing and its Antecedents. By antecedents, I simply mean some of the even ancient works that inform the present, and we've already explored some of that. So we'll just look at that again and perhaps in more detail. And as you can see, I'll go sometimes. Even in the days ahead, I will talk about some of the historical precedents for what we're reading to remind us. I think that's very important to say where we're coming from, where the field has come from, and what might be, as we end the week, what might be some of the future critical components of where we're heading. So this one will be some readings of certain works that you may well be familiar with, and more than me, such as the Mahabharata and Shakuntala and so forth, which, as I said, are very influential in Western ways of looking at nature. So the first one is, by the way, I should add that at the end of that, I would like to review some post-colonial terms that I did not have time prior to this to do, just so we end the day with this first day with a kind of overview of the whole field. The Mahabharata, I mean, it's been translated so many times, and there are some very scholastic translations that go on for many volumes, right, with a lot of footnotes. But I've read a couple of different versions, but I just recently saw a version that I've only read some small parts of by Carol Satyamurthy. Died a few years ago. About 10 years ago, she published a very well-received translation called Mahabharata, A Modern Retelling. So it's very poetic, and again, it's the way we translate. Translation is a big part of this field because if you span the globe, you have to translate. So this, I'll just read a bit of this, but she was, as she said, she was eager she had read this work and studied it for many decades, but was eager to get a broader readership in English, and so that spurred her to translate it. So I'm citing an example of that epic's descriptions of nature, even when describing a city like Indraprastha or something else. So because I want to emphasize we talked about the interaction or interconnection between city and countryside, right? So this also tells us that that's been an ancient concern. So this is just a few lines from her translation. Around the city were tranquil parks and gardens, planned and planted with arbors, cooling fountains, lily ponds, and many kinds of tree and flowering shrub. Kadamba, jasmine, mango, and rose apple, and others too numerous to name. So all who strolled there could enjoy bright, scented flowers and luscious fruit at all times of the year. Peacocks picked their way beneath the trees, which were a haven for melodious birds. So the idea of a kind of ideal city in which ordinary residents could enjoy nature, right? That interconnection. So that has been a dream, and perhaps a reality, but certainly a dream for a long, long time. The Dvaita forest and other forests are similarly described, though we also, of course, encounter forests inhabited by rakshasas and dangerous creatures. The point I want to convey, as someone who reads these epics and I have taught a mythology course as a survey course for undergraduates, is we also look at the aesthetic and literary qualities, right? So rather than, if you're teaching mythology from around the world, and by mythology I mean great, truthful stories, you have to look at the literary and aesthetic more than the religious. Such descriptions appear in many other works of ancient literature, of course, and as I said, they inform our the present writings of the present. And I think this is what, of course, Tagore had an essay on this, The Religion of the Forest, 120 years ago, something like that. And we also have, we mentioned Aranyak and other works that I think were consciously responding to this ancient ideal. But there are many other ways of looking at this as well. And I mentioned Gilgamesh as an example of that, right? So in the same way, since city dwellers have been the ones writing these, the city and its ruler tend to be the chief concerns. Because remember I mentioned Gilgamesh, and so ultimately it's still about Gilgamesh the king, right? Even if you're talking about the cedar forests being cut down. And so that's understandable. It's just that we have to keep that in mind. One thing that all cities require, and I've alluded to this, is raw materials. So, and those raw materials tend to be timber, especially, and that's why, we tend to think of archaeological remains as stone, but that's only because the wood part, most of the structures were wood, and those have disappeared, right? As modern eco-critical readers, we could provide some ecological context to this decline. For example, Yellowstone National Park, which is the big volcanic area not too far, about 3 hours drive from where I live. There, the government allowed professional ecologists to reintroduce a pack of wolves to the park from Canada. And you may be wondering, what does this have to do with what I've been talking about? But I'll get to that. Wolves were native to Yellowstone, but human interference had led to their eventual absence. And this, ecologists realized, had led to the proliferation of elk, which is a cousin of reindeer, large deer, very big ones, who then ate so many of the young leaves in the trees in the park that within a few years, the park's forests began to disappear. This, in turn, had a cascading effect on the ecosystem, a trophic cascade, different ways that ecologists use this, right? In 1989, ecologists released a Canadian wolf pack into Yellowstone, and within a few short years, the effects were dramatic. As the elk population diminished to a healthy number, trees were able to grow, and an entire ecosystem was restored just by reintroducing wolves. What's interesting is we have in the state I live in, a vehement anti-wolf contingent. And that is because the same thing that the British in the 19th century in India called leopards vermin. That means like pests, rats. And that's how many of them still view the wolves there, because they say they're a threat to ranching, which is sheep herding and so forth. But the evidence is clear. If you remove certain apex predators from an ecosystem, you can have a collapse. Along with this success story, we must remind ourselves that when the Native American tribes that used to live in Yellowstone before white settlers removed them, there was no damaging interference. This does not mean that we romanticize the Native Americans again. We have learned, for example, that even 1,000 years ago, certain Native American peoples burned forests to create prairie, pasture land and so forth. But on the other hand, the difference is that now it's on such a massive scale that the lands cannot recover. What does this have to do with what I mentioned in the Gilgamesh? I think the lesson is that we can look at these texts as evidence. Historians actually look at these ancient texts, like Sangam literature, for example, because there aren't many other surviving historical documents. And if you look at the area of the Levant, or maybe Lebanon in that area, and Iraq, there's a you can see online how the ancient what they estimate was the ancient range of the cedar forest has shrunk. It's hardly existing. It's a very tiny a number now that exists only in Lebanon. So we can see that this is almost like a record, Gilgamesh, if you read it that way, of that kind of collapse. And if you read Gilgamesh, which again is a very fast read, it's you'll see that Gilgamesh has to, and Enkidu, they kill the guardian of the forest, who's a monstrous kind of creature, Humbaba. And when they do that, despite the fact that the gods have put this guardian there. So that right there is telling you that 5,000, 6,000 years ago, they were aware that on the one hand they're killing this creature, but on the other hand, some gods are supporting Gilgamesh. So it's a paradox, right? But in any case, I'm not sure that they had in mind that this would be a collapse of an ecosystem, but they did have an inkling that resources are finite, right? That humans are interfering in these ecosystems. So my modern example from Yellowstone is just a way to make that connection to the present. We'll turn now to Shakuntala by Kalidasa in terms of how it was translated and its effects. So a well-known 1912 translator, British translator, Arthur Ryder, echoes other scholars in noting that Kalidasa's work reflects, and Kalidasa lived about 1,500 years ago, so just to keep that chronology in mind, and was, of course, famous for his amazing drama at the time, as well as the rasa system theory of aesthetic taste and so forth. He said that Kalidasa's works reflect his amazingly close and accurate observations of the phenomena of living nature, such as describing the Ashoka trees that, quote unquote, shed his blossoms in a rain of tears, in the translation. It's still very poetic, right? And others have pointed out the same thing about, for example, other epics that are very, like Valmiki's epics and so forth, that are very faithful to the natural habitat and fairly accurate, right, in how they record things. And of course, a lot of these trees, I don't have to tell you, are very sacred. So that too makes them important to record in an epic. Another reason to know or be familiar with the basics of this drama is because, as I said, it profoundly influenced European Romanticism. Sir William Jones first translated the play from Sanskrit in the late 1700s, and I think perhaps you know, here my throat is scratchy again, but excuse me, perhaps you know that he was one of the progenitors, sometimes you could say founders, but not the only one, but certainly William Jones was one of the first to notice that the Indo-European language system, that is to say Sanskrit and Latin being very close, similar. That's because he knew Latin already. He was quite an amazing linguist. And then he learned Sanskrit within a year after arriving, and through great study, thanks, and saw that they formed this part. So if you're studying linguistics today, you will know his name. we are looking at him for this other aspect that influence he had. When Jones's English translation, and in English, and I put it in the notes, he calls it Sakuntala, or the fatal ring, right? When it first appeared in 1789, it was a sensation, as I said, in German translation. And Goethe, the famous romantic writer from Germany, who was, by the way, very much enamored and an amateur naturalist, right? So that we should keep in mind. When he even wrote an epigram praising the play in 1791. These patriotic intellectuals were seeking to extol the German landscape in ways that tied it to a deep historical past, one that they claimed was in ancient India. Ironically, European Romanticism would deeply influence Indian nationalist intellectuals in the 1800s. I should also say that there's a footnote here that we don't have time for, and that is that while Goethe had a kind of healthy sense of nationalism, there were some others who, in the 19th century, Germans, who took that further and ironically turned to the area of Germany called the Black Forest, as a kind of essence. Remember that word essentialism? As the essence of the German people, the folk. But that, sadly, by the mid to late 1800s had transpired. As it transpired, it became part of a more narrow-minded nationalism that would eventually feed into Nazism. So we have to be careful of this, how far this goes, right? But as far as Goethe, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on German literature, but as far as I know, he did not go to that degree. He saw it as a healthy kind of way to think of national spirit. Now, it's interesting that so many that, as I said, Bankim Chandra, with his idea of the forest as sort of the cradle of a kind of spiritual reawakening, as well as an anti-colonial rebellion, thought of the forest. We think of Fenimore Cooper. I mentioned the Last of the Mohicans forest, right? We have the Black Forest, Germany. If you start to look around the world, that's why I wrote the book on forests. You see that it tends, not for every nation, but because the landscape partly determines what you invoke, right? Because if you're in a desert environment, the desert becomes important. But it's interesting how often the forests become important, but it's also interesting how often nature becomes important. So I'll come back to that point. It's either at the end of this lecture or tomorrow. We also have Sangam poetry, and until not that long ago, scholars say, I think Sangam was kind of overshadowed by Sanskrit, the dominance of Sanskrit. So it's important to think that they were coterminous at the same time. The Sangam was a long period, but let's say roughly 1,500 years ago, so coterminous with Kalidasa. Like forests everywhere, forests in India are often in the public imagination and in much of literature, conflations of their everyday use with their mythic religious association. So there is this everyday use. For example, logging in the Western United States, logging is a big problem, right? Now, they're not allowed to log all the forests, and like here, right, you have to be controlled in some way. So there's that aspect, and people will assume that that's fine. But then with the other half of our brain, we kind of mythologize and idealize the forest. In the book, The Overstory, and I'll come back to Sangam in a second, but in the book, The Overstory, is an interesting note that in the 1980s, something I didn't know, the along the certain highways in the western U.S., they would leave us a wall of trees right along the highway, but they would log behind that. So people didn't get, they had the scenic view, and it was a kind of false view of what was happening. So this is always there. So we know that backdrop. And so in Sangam poetry and epic, you do get forests. You also have different areas of landscape. So let me continue reading this. In the classical Tamil text, for example, scholars call Forest of Pines. It insists on locating the religious story in the holy forests of the Himalaya, right? To account for the environmental ethos of such texts. So there are certain, even in southern texts, they might have a religious tie to the north, but then you have the everyday reality. I hope I'm articulating this well, but you have the everyday reality. So, for example, the Kadamba tree becomes important because for certain Sangam era kings, the Kadamba was used to make a kind of a scepter, kind of for the royal figure. So trees were very important, but at the same time, the trees in the north, due to the epics, the Mahabharata and so forth, become valued. To account for this, and the environmental ethos of such text means that we need to, quote unquote, foreground the poetics of creativity and the politics of imagination and placemaking. The formal poetics plays a vital role in that both ancient and medieval Tamil poetry developed and ascribed to literary conventions that pertain as much to topographical contexts as to linguistic ones, like the Thinnai that some of you know, right? The five Thinnai. So the topography has, it's interesting that you would use then topography, right? You would use that as an associational index for what you want to convey, the feelings you want to convey. So if you say, the Kurinji forest, that automatically associates a certain number of things. David Schulman, a scholar of Tamil, calls this, quote, a patterned semiotic map of Tamil country, unquote, that readers would have been familiar with. Of course, not everyone was literate, so those who were literate would have been familiar with this, just as with Kalidasa's drama. In the Sangam era, roughly the 1st through 4th century CE, it's debating, let's say even up to about 500 CE, prominent genres like war poetry or Puram and love poetry or Akam, I hope I'm pronouncing these right, variously evoked the 5 primary landscapes, Thinnai, of Tamil country. Each was named after a flower native to it. These also changed over time, but that was one prominent motif. These poems are notable for their comparatively secular or non-religious topics. So these love poems, that's what's fascinating. And that's why they've become very popular in the last 20 years in English literary anthologies of world literature. They were not before, but then R.K. Ramanujan and others translated them, and slowly they became well known. A later or 8th or 9th century Tamil prose treatise, The Grammar of Stolen Love, that consolidates these poetics, is notable for its rich descriptions of Thinnai flora, and although the work is couched in more explicitly religious language, it is said to be written by Lord Shiva. The arboreal details, that is the tree details related to trees, reflect a decidedly sensorial attentiveness. So appealing to all the senses, right? That was important. So here we have ancient works, and again, I've said this before, that are very attuned to the natural environment, right? That must have, no doubt, in a very real way. So no doubt these environments were important to the people living there. And as we know, if you go back even 2,000 plus years, the global trade. You had pepper going to Rome and things like that, right? And vice versa. So a lot of these environments were not only important to sustaining local life, but they were important to trade and economy. So you have a whole kind of ecosystem of if you will, that relates to the humans. For example, to give you an example of this, a couple meeting in a forest are aware of the myriad numbers of trees and their fragrances. So I'll just read this translation. All about are sandalwood trees, champak trees, sweet mango trees, sweet jackfruit trees, breadfruit trees, ashoka trees, gong trees, kino trees, I'm not even sure what all these are, ipecacuana trees, gamboge, Barbados pride. These are the modern English. Crocus vines, copperleaf, delight of the woods, jasmine, and Arabian jasmine combine their fragrances together. That's pretty specific. More than I think any modern poet would write. Oh, we're not finished. Trumpet flowers, screw pine, and fresh laburnum burst open. Waterthorn, purslane, and lemon flowers blossom. That means that the readers were attuned to these, right? Is there something that we've lost even in the literate world? So we have the indigenous world, the interaction with nature, but we tend to think of ourselves as we're progressing, right? We keep learning more, we have more science, we learn more, but maybe not. Maybe we've lost something in the literate world. So the combination of realist, mythical, religious, and fabulous texts that express regional and national aspirations, not in the modern nation-state sense, but regional pride, leads to contradictions. For example, as Ramaswamy notes, Sumati Ramaswamy, who's written about some fabulous texts about Mother India, but also about the lost land of Lemuria, she notes that some Tamil writers of the early 20th century sought to celebrate the fabled lost land of the Tamils, Lemuria, by drawing on modern science. So then you get the paradox of using modern science to try to account for these fabled lands. And she's interested as a literary scholar and a historian in how, what does that say about people's sentiments? What is it that this idea of a lost land, right, tell us about what humans want? What are they craving, right? Evocations of this lost land, and I can't do justice to her works, so I won't try, but I encourage you to look at her works. So Sumati Ramaswamy. Evocations of this lost homeland also draw on the 5 classic Tamil toponyms that we've talked about. Thinnai. And the specifics of these, which are interesting, I think, are riverine plains, and those of you who speak Tamil can correct me, Marutam, coastal areas, Natal, pastures, Mullai, desert, Pallai, forest, Kurinji. Now we know that the Kurinji flower still blossoms every 12 years, so that's interesting, and so I think that's fascinating. Ramaswamy observes that sustaining these in both the popular and the literary imagination was important for Tamils since colonialism's, what she says, disciplinary geography had generally disavowed native categories and specialities as so many seas of treacle and seas of butter, in the words of one Englishman. And I think this is another aspect of eco-criticism, post-colonial eco-criticism, is to talk about how, if you're interested, how cartography, map making, which involves naming, is a powerful tool. So if you're interested, there's, I forget the writer, who's the critic, Australian scholar about 30 years ago wrote The Road to Botany Bay about the naming of Australia. I mean, all the names are very British, right? And displace the Aboriginal names. You know these kinds of stories. There's also the fact that we have, lost my train of thought. There's a great play, if you're interested, called Translations, by an Irish playwright, and I'll think of his name in a minute, but who Friel, F-R-I-E-L. It's called Translations. It's wonderful to teach. It's a 1980 play, and it's about how the Irish themselves were colonized. We forget that, right? But what's interesting is it's about these map makers, these topographers, whatever they were called. These British guys come in and they start renaming all the places, right? And so some of the Irish want to fight back, some don't. It's a classic colonial case. This is set in the early 1800s, though it's written in 1980, but it's set in the early 1800s. So what we have is, I think, you have this Tamil country map, in a sense. Then on top of that, you have the colonial map, right? The modern, which stays there still for all practical purposes, even though the state names change. So how do you reconcile those? That's the challenge. Same thing happens to Native Americans. So let me give you one more example, which I had in my notes already, but I know it so well. There's a place called Devil's Tower in the western state of Wyoming, not that far from where I live. It's drivable. And it's a unique formation that juts out a kind of karst. It's as geologists call it. So it sticks up and it looks like it's scarred, right? These scars. And it's become a very important symbol. And it's preserved, but it's a very important symbol for tourism, for one thing, but also for the Native Americans, the Kiowa tribe. There's a wonderful story behind that too. So the other thing we can do is look at native traditional mythic stories about how lands get their shape, how animals get their colors. Not to say that this happened, but to say it suggests why these are so valuable to the people. So the story is that, and we're going to talk about M. Scott Momaday later this week, who's a great writer of the Kiowa. I think he's still alive. One of the sort of progenitors of modern Native American writing, and this Devil's Tower, he tells the story of the Kiowa story of, it looks like a giant bear has clawed it. And he talks about how in their tradition, two boys are running away, right, from this bear, and they climb to the top of this karst, and then a giant bear tries to scrape at them, but before it can get to them, they are taken by the gods to become stars in the sky. So it's a wonderful story. But how do we can read these eco-critically too, right? Does that make sense? So these are ancient stories too. We don't have dates because they're oral. Sangam and Mahabharata and all these things are literate. They've been set down. But most classic epic stories, I should say, start as oral tales. So I want to keep that in the back of our minds. Let me come back to the Sangam just for a few minutes, and then we'll turn to some modern treatments of things. The ecology expressed in Kurinji or mountain forest poems is unique to Tamil Nadu with its shola, a now endangered rainforest, right? You know about shola. Though they're trying to revive it, but we'll see. Sangam poems conventionally use this motif to express the secret premarital meetings of lovers. At the time of the poem's writing, and sometimes even now, the Kurinji flower recalls romance. As Ramanujan puts it in commenting on the Sangam poems he translates, these are his words, the actual objective landscapes of Tamil country become the interior landscape of Tamil poetry. That's another fascinating way to think about landscape as interiorized, right? How we always exteriorize it as and objectify it. But if we say that we are part of nature, as we are, then perhaps psychologically too, I'm not sure how we make sense of all this, but certainly we can think of a kind of cognitive mapping of the world. that we associate with, right? I mean, we know that as humans, certain senses recall moments from childhood, right? Nostalgic moments. So I think in the same way, for a lot of Native peoples, the power of the land, right, is recalled through ritual songs and folk tales and so on. Here's a snippet of, just for fun to give a taste of this. This is one called, he calls it, because they don't have titles, right? What her girlfriend said. O long white moonlight, you do him no good at all as he comes stealing through the night in the forest, where the black-stemmed venkai drops its flowers on the round stones and makes them look like tiger cubs in the half-light. Sounds very modern to my mind, right? Love, romantic love has a kind of, you wouldn't even say an objective correlative, as Eliot called it. I would say it's more an interiorized correlative. So a way to, because in a lot of modern writing, you talk about an exterior storm happening, and that mimics the storm of emotions. But that still sets up a duality, right? Here, it's trying to break down that duality. Western readers often assume that the personal voice here points to autobiography, but as Ramanujan notes, poetic convention dictated that, for example, a speaker's greater range of motifs reflects both gender, a man's is wider, and class. This is in the Sangam period. The higher class heroine usually having less experience and mobility in the world than her girlfriend. These are not meant to be realistic, though the names of the plants and trees are, but not the meetings. Sangam poets relied on these and other dramatic conventions, including those governing social roles and topographical associations. In his words, the poet's language is not only Tamil. The landscapes, the personae, the appropriate moods all become a language within a language. Getting us back to, I think, Ghosh's point in The Hungry Tide, which is that when we talk about translation, it's not just about human language. And it's not just about, that's one thing. And it's not just about the typical verbal language, but there's a sort of semiotics of landscape and topography that if you know the conventions, you can decipher. And it's hard even for scholars of Tamil, it's hard to recapture entirely that those past conventions. One more paragraph on this. Sangam poetic landscapes are a product then of the symbolism of particular geographies in which the poet is nurtured with the aim of evoking a credibly sincere sentiment. So the effect is also important. These are sentiments that any reader today can recognize, even if the landscapes are unfamiliar. That's why they're so popular now. Another way to interpret this, the different ways, is to say that a reading of these poetic landscapes generates a compensatory reality in the way that Subhati Ramaswamy suggests. So it's especially true of exilic voices, for example, where the displacement of peoples, whether geographic or cultural, is expressed as loss, as Ramaswamy argues in her study of Lemuria. So loss can also be figured symbolically if you have a memory, either a cultural memory or a personal memory of having left a homeland, right? Then you can figure loss in different ways. In a lot of post-colonial writing, sometimes during the colonial era, you will have the sense of loss of your culture, of freedom, figured as a kind of mourning, a grieving. So that motif comes up a lot in a lot of earlier post-colonial writing. It's not to say that the writing can't be joyful, I don't mean that, but there is a strain. Let me turn to, before I get to as we get towards the end here, and then, yes. So now I think I'm jumping now back to the modern period. The idea was to make to put them together, juxtapose these, in the hope that we would see some correspondences. Whether that's true or not in a survey, it's hard to know. It's better to look at these, study them. But that was my aim. So now I'll come to neo-colonial legacies and toxic discourse. And we talked about toxic discourse, but I'm going to look at Animals, People here, the 2007 novel about the 1984 Bhopal disaster, and which has been written about quite extensively, and more recently by Pramod Nair from Hyderabad. And a lot of people have written about Animals, People, as it turns out. I was surprised. So, but it's not to say that's the only work, but it's because Bhopal is such a important, everyone kind of knows it. But you could turn this to so many. We talked about Ken Saro-Wiwa before the break, petroculture. This overlaps with that. Right? That's, as I said, a lot of these overlap. Petrocultures, like what his Ogoni people were forced into becoming, but that is to say, they were conditioned by the fact that their fate was conditioned by the fact that they lived on petroleum-rich lands. It's similar here because you've got this toxic discourse. That is to say, something in the natural environment that either, as Rachel Carson showed, is a kind of light that suddenly happens, or it's part of slow violence that we talked about, right? This idea that violence happens slowly, or it's not always visible with the eyes. So neocolonialism is one aspect of this, and neocolonialism can take different, basically neo meaning new forms of colonialism, so, as we know. So it could be through economic, say the Western country, corporations coming in, but it can also be interior. So how different colonial paradigms are enacted within a country, all right? For example, the proliferation of Coca-Cola plants in developing countries following World War II was possible in part because those governments eagerly welcomed such corporations in the name of economic development, which gives us the catchy term coined about 20 years ago, Coca-colonization. Right. In reality, this often meant that a select few in those countries got rich while most of their compatriots did not. Environmental disaster is self-explanatory, right? But it doesn't capture the imagination. Though it's important to note that the less resources a region has, the worse such a disaster's effects. As happened in 1984, 1985, with India following the Bhopal, at that time, of course, right, long time, 40 years ago, following the poison gas leak. So in Animals, People, as some of you may be familiar with, 2007 novel. It's interesting if you're haven't read it. For artistic license, Sinha changes the city's name to Kaufpur, City of Fear. Gives him more license, right? He's gonna be more imaginative. Here's a snippet from the novel that describes such effects. I'll just, again, an example. Ellie feels horror, also the failure of her imagination. She's unable to imagine the cries of the dying, of those who lost their families in the stamp of panicking people, the thirst-tormented cries of men and women whose children's hands had been ripped from theirs. So the sentence doesn't have much punctuation intentionally. One woman there was who, knowing that she was dying, instead of festive lamps, the house itself was torched, wrapped her newborn son in her shawl and laid him in a doorway, hoping he'd be found. The colors used at this wedding were bloodstains by someone who would love him. Ellie's thinking that this woman was perhaps lucky not to have seen the furnace that melted her son's spine. Graphic, right? Intentionally so, to prompt people to think about toxic discourse. The danger is that you might think, and I think that is a real danger, is that this may seem such an aberration, like, oh, this couldn't happen here, kind of thing, right? So I think the challenge is there are texts now that do show how, as Carson did, that we are all exposed to this. I mean, we all have microplastics in us. I'm not sure what that says about the future, but maybe I shouldn't drink. But what does that say about our human cells, right? And so, but it's hard to sort of, if that's true, what can we do about that, right? We can't do something. So it's hard to imaginatively make people aware that within their own communities, wherever they are, there's this problem. But nonetheless, I think it's a powerful novel. There are lots of motifs in here that relate to eco-critical, post-colonial eco-criticism. What's interesting is he calls the company, he uses the colloquial spelling Kampani, which invokes the East India Company, not coincidentally, which I'm not sure that the American readers catch that, but this idea that the grounds of the factory are decayed. What's fascinating is that Animal, as he calls himself, likes to go to these closed off grounds. I actually saw this. Has anyone been to Bhopal and seen this? You have, yeah. The gate is still, when I was there about 10 years ago, right? And talking to people about it. But he goes in there and he lives there. And what's fascinating is it shows the regeneration of the power of nature to regenerate, right? And if you're interested, and I haven't even much read about this, but there are a lot of nonfiction works out, both film and books, essays, books about Chernobyl, for example, and how it's rebounding. Certainly some of the animals have slight genetic changes, but not to the detrimental effect that they had worried about. Still not good, but the reason I mention that is that it does remind us that this sort of apocalyptic idea can also be very anthropocentric, because it can say that because humans are going to die out, that's the end of the world. I think we're going to die out and the world will continue, right? So there's a book called The World Without Us, right? Which is about 10 years ago, which is what happened, this guy, journalist, science writer, imagines what happens if humans are erased. What does it look like in reality? How are the plants going to rejuvenate and things like that? So there is a small portion of eco-critics who look at urban regeneration this way, where parts of cities that have been abandoned or big lots, and urban ecology has always been a part of ecologists. But in this case of the urban, you don't often think of the urban environment as being one for eco-criticism, but it is. So that's something I wanted to mention. So decay, there's also madness. It's interesting because he also has kind of hybrid community here, which is fascinating. He talks about that. And love is a big prominent theme here about the sort of persistence of love and the sustaining aspect of it. But again, I don't think he tries to romanticize this, right? And what's fascinating is by the end, Animal, who has to walk on all fours, that's why he calls himself Animal, right? He is offered life-changing surgery, right? And he then refuses it. Because then he says, what's his identity without that? But back to the idea of this toxic discourse, I think that it's also a question of environmental justice, isn't it? Because to this day, a lot of the victims have not received hardly any recompense, if any. And so this, and it's a sad story of both the Dow Chemical American terrible company, and it's then how it sort of paid off certain government officials and things like that. So it's a story that's similar to Ken Saro-Wiwa's story. There are a number of questions we could ask. Just to give you an example, if you were teaching this, you could ask things like, what does animal mean when he says he used to be human once? What does being human mean to animal? What does animal believe it would take for him to become human again? Does animal get his wish? And I think so, in a weird way, it invites animal studies, even though there's no non-human animal really so much in here. There are dogs and things, but nothing prominent. I think it's mainly saying that, well, what if humans, it's not human animal and non-human animal, but it's just animal. You know what I mean? So, so I think I just say one more thing, that the book's title is also important because it says animals, people. So the emphasis is on community. So the emphasis is on the idea that it's not an individual, that's what's going to sustain and all of us. I think most of these writers are all about that, right? Because so often the history of the novel, for example, has been one, as we know, if you go back, to the 1700s and so forth, it's one about sort of the individual, right? And kind of like the solitary romantic ideal, who makes, usually a he, not always, Maul Flanders is an exception, makes his or her way in the world, right? And so forth. But the community is kind of often lost, right? And so I think certainly Sinha is trying to accentuate this idea of community, and it's a heterogeneous community. It's not any single type of community. And I think that's important. Pramod Nair, in his book, 2017 book, Bhopal's Ecological Gothic, uses the Gothic as a frame to read Bhopal, these are his words, as event, as place, as effect, and its precarious nature, as a means of signifying the disaster's continuing disaster through haunting. The Gothic trope, Gothic genre, but also the trope of haunting, is a powerful one in many contexts. We're going to look at Beloved, for example, later this week by Toni Morrison. And so this idea of the ghost as a figure that haunts us in different ways. Gothicization allows for the reading, this is what I'm saying about Nair, allows for the reading of the disaster in terms of death and bodily decay, and an eco-critical lens allows us to see how the disaster encompasses both all life forms as well as all non-human materials. So this idea of bodily, the focus on the body, the interaction of the body with the environment has also become a big theme, such as Stacey Alaimo talking about bodily natures, a feminist view of material ecofeminism, and if you're interested in that. One reviewer of the novel, of the book, Liam O'Loughlin, helpfully summarizes Nair's approach. So I thought this was helpful. This is O'Loughlin. Rather than evoking the terror and psychological disintegration of an individual protagonist, this Gothic is deeply connected to a collective experience, a body linked to a body politic, haunted not by the supernatural, but by, obviously, but the continually denied promise of rebirth and regeneration. He adds, if much of eco-horror, which is a big genre too, articulates environmental anxieties and fears in a cautionary mode of potential catastrophe, Nair offers an important corrective locating the ecological Gothic in a recent past and ongoing present. I'll read one more paragraph, this from Rob Nixon, his reading of the book. He says that Sinha's book can be read as a novel of risk relocation. Time as well for the transnational offloading of risk from a privileged community to an impoverished one changes the temporal topography of fear in the long term. So risk, as I mentioned, insurance companies won't insure now for certain things. So this idea of risk, what are we willing to risk and what not, and so on. It's typically the privileged communities that don't risk as much. Now this was put to the test and changed recently in Los Angeles with the Pacific Palisades fire that demolished many film stars' homes. And so, sadly, it sometimes takes celebrities, destruction to bring attention to this kind of thing. Just like microplastics in us, this is not something that is related to your place or class. However, that said, I think environmental justice is still a huge topic, right? A problem. That Frantz Fanon talks about in The Wretched of the Earth, which we can get to sometime. So Nixon, just let me see if there's something worth here. I thought Nixon's idea of calling Sinha's novel, if you get a chance to read it or if you're familiar with it, he calls it the environmental picaresque. So the picaresque is the picaro from way back in the 1500s, a sort of Spanish form of episodic, crazy events, right? It's an updated version of the picaresque, but it's environmental. And he says that by creatively adapting Renaissance picaresque conventions to our age, Sinha probes the underbelly of neoliberal globalization from the vantage point of an indigent social outcast. His novel gives focus to three of the defining characteristics of the contemporary neoliberal order. And he wrote this in 2011, his book. First, the widening chasm within and between nations that separates the mega-rich from the destitute. Second, the attendant burden of unsustainable ecological degradation that impacts the health and livelihood of the poor most directly. And third, the way powerful transnational corporations exploit, under cover of a free market ideology, the lopsided universe of deregulation whereby laws and loopholes are selectively applied to a marketplace a lot freer for some societies and classes than others. So this was a preventable disaster. That's one thing. So we have two types of disasters. One is they're both human caused, but one is the direct kind of cause of the mishaps of a greedy corporation and produces a direct disaster. But we also have the slow burning, right? Slow violence of climate change and toxic. Some may be easier to portray than others, right? And by that I mean it's hard to deal with. I think Amitav Ghosh was right, but it's hard for us to imaginatively capture that or to provoke readers, right? We need a lot of Greta Thunbergs. Anyway, so, but the thing is that there are writers trying to do that today. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, I think we're getting, we still have a few minutes here. I wanted to, that was, I think, there was a documentary called there are many documentaries on Bhopal, but the one I was thinking of was One Night in Bhopal in 2004 BBC documentary, only because it's one that's been viewed a lot. It's not to say it's the best or anything. There's also a kind of a bad movie with, who's that actor, Dev Patel? I think he's in it. Yeah, not very good. He's a good actor. I don't mean that. I have nothing against Dave. But the thing is that it's interesting how that becomes a sensationalized way of entertainment. That's the danger, right? And whereas I think this one could be accused of that, but I think it tried not to. I don't know. The Marxist cultural critic Zizek has argued that our modern, generally middle-class view of the world, as projected in an array of media, is sanitized, dependent on the erasure of waste from any images. So there's also a whole sub-area of critique and subgenre of waste, garbage, Okay, but that is visible waste. Now we come to waste that radioactive. There's only one country in the world that is specializing in containing nuclear radioactive waste anymore. Other countries just decided to not worry about it. Finland. I know that because a postgraduate student of ours did a Fulbright there, and that was the only country that was doing it. And that's scary, right? Just one country. I mean, Finland's great. Maybe they'll master it, but that waste is intangible. Fukushima, right? How do you quantify that? So, but it's still interesting to think about this idea of waste. The film theorist Siegfried Krakauer argues that it is especially incumbent on filmmakers to bring attention to garbage and waste since cameras are uniquely equipped to reveal this. So cameras can zoom in and out, and so forth. But Carl Schoonover, I love these names, right, points out that this view, though important, assumes that waste is visible and overlooks the toxins that are rife in modern life. Because toxins do not degrade, Schoonover says, they could be seen as refusing to ever leave this world, our world. It is possible that human interference will never surpass the persistence of toxicity's force. In this sense, the toxic challenges standard definitions of materiality and objectness. Now, this becomes very philosophical, right? As you can see, it invites a lot of philosophers writing about this. But again, if we bring this back to literature and we say, how do you portray that, right? And I think that's the challenge. And I mentioned Jane Bennett earlier. The book, by the way, it's an interesting book. It's a 2009 book called Vibrant Matter. So, Schoonover concludes his article with thought-provoking questions. What then are the specifics of the toxic discourse present in recent eco-docs, as they call them? Environmental, ecological documentaries. In narrating specific ecological realities, do they acknowledge how the toxic profoundly challenges everyday notions of materiality, or do they play into our phantasmic nightmares, where plastic bottles lead directly to cancer, all lipstick is laden with lead, and nature is forever lost? As I've suggested, he says, it seems clear that they invest in spectacles of rubbish in a fetishistic in a kind of fetishization of matter that allows us to affirm the horrific new forms of 21st century waste while simultaneously denying them. All this means is that we can become, again, the sensationalization of this, a kind of horror is a kind of fascination with the grotesque, right? As Kristeva says, the abject. Well, if you're we do have a fascination for that as humans, right? So on the one hand, when we started today with saying about the pure landscapes, purity. I think purity, as Mary Douglas said long ago, purity and danger tend to be interesting correlatives that frame a lot of human society. So what we say is taboo and what we say is totem. So if we're not careful, we can just produce as many documentaries as we want. But I think there's still room for that. So at the end of this course, we'll look at some interesting photographs and things that I think make us pause. So I'll stop there on that. And then in the last few minutes here, actually, we're out of time. But no, we have 1 minute, I believe. And I'll come back to this tomorrow at the top of the hour. But there are a number of post-colonial critical points that I just jotted down not long before I came here. And one, I'm just going to mention a couple of them. One is this idea of the Creole, the cultures, right? Creole or Creolization, which is hybridity. But it also, so hybridity depends on this idea of mixing two cultures to kind of create a third culture, if you will, sometimes, right? And that's what humans have been doing all along. Right. It's just that it becomes more intensified in colonialism. This is the theorist Homi Bhabha. On the other hand, Creole and Creolization, they're very closely related, and they tend to be used in the context of the Caribbean. But in any case, what's interesting about that is it says that you create a new like Creole language. We sometimes call Creole can be used for a person, for the food, culture, and the language. And so sometimes we can produce a new language that is just as viable, which is Pidgin, for example. It's a variety for linguists. We'll call that's a language. And so it's not something that's below, less valuable than a dominant language. And I think that's something to keep in mind. So do we have Creole natures, right? Do we have Creole hybrid forests, right? Things like that. That's something to think about. I think I'll leave it at that for now because I want to come back to these. I think we're out of time for today. So I will start with those tomorrow. Thank you very much. And I believe that's the end of the lecture here. I'll have a few minutes for if you have questions. Love to talk with you. I know you're all tired. You've come a long way, right? And there's lots to see in Jaipur. We're going to talk about the problems with tourism, but don't let that get you down. No, I'm just. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any. And this won't be the only time, but. This will be off, not recorded. So. Or anything to extrapolate on? Yeah, did you?
So I was just thinking while you were talking about the indigenous way of looking at land and the colonizers way of looking at it. I would rather take settler and the indigenous. So I was thinking that most of the times, right now, the more we discover the indigenous system or indigenous ways of looking at land, the connection to land. And because it's currently still happening, colonization hasn't exactly ended. So, taking all the observations from whatever I see around, the settlers' idea, and I'm here specifically talking about the romantic idea of nature, almost seem like, and I'm running this observation through you, almost seem like, okay, we came to this land where there was already an existing relationship to the land. We observed it. This is an existing knowledge system. We need to colonize these people. So in order to counter that, we have to have our own knowledge system because then we'll say, this one better than that one. So then then comes Thoreau or Waldo and says, I want to go to the forest, I want to go to this. So if we tell the world, look at how we're looking at land, look at how we're looking at land. And then we want you to forget how the Maoris wanted to forget it, how the other